Hello and welcome to the tutorial video for what we call the Section 174 Addback, which is a fancy way of saying R&D expense addback. If you're watching this video, it means we've probably had a discussion with you about how, at least for the time being, the law technically says that we can no longer get an immediate write-off for R&D spending in the year that we pay for it. Rather, the law currently says that we need to add that spending back to our taxable income and slow down how fast we expense it by expensing it over anywhere between 5 and 15 years, depending on whether it was a U.S. expense or a foreign expense. So this video is intended to help us put a number on what that 174 add back would look like if we end up doing it. Obviously, before the tax return gets filed, we'll make a plan with you that blends our recommendation with whatever you approve. So as far as getting a number on this thing, it helps to point out that most people watching this video are already claiming an R&D tax credit. And there's certain expenses in the credit that, well, really every expense in the credit is what we call a 174 expense. Code section 174 just being old language that helps define what R&D means today. So all R&D credit spending is section 174 spending. But there's other spending that isn't going to help us for the credit that's 174 spending. It's basically R&D spending that the credit doesn't care about. Our credit is very focused on wages and contract labor and materials. So if we do a credit for you, we can already come up with those numbers. And with those numbers, that will help us come up with some other numbers, like down here, your payroll taxes or health insurance for employees. Whatever ratio of R&D spending to total spending we have, we can help come up with that percentage and estimate what percentage of these incidental labor costs are going to R&D. But there's a lot of spending that a company typically has in its profit and loss statement that we might need you to take a look at, and that's what this video is here to help with. So what I've done here is I started with a company's example P&L or profit and loss statement. And I'm just going down the line looking at the spending and asking myself, is it spending that probably has no R&D, that maybe has some R&D, but I got to look under the hood a little bit? So something we probably already know what the credit is or what the spending is because we do a credit. And here's some more under the hood looking where there's likely to be some R&D coming out of that. Now, before we go too deep into any of these items, it's important to point out that many people believe this 174 thing is going to go away. If not by the time we file a tax return, then, perhaps in the future they make it go away and retroactively. So before somebody just spends dozens of hours on trying to get these numbers perfect, then it's worth noting that it might be an exercise in futility in the long run. And even if it's not, we still got to be practical instead of like, what's a good example here? The telephone expense. Imagine going through a phone log of every phone call and trying to decide how many minutes were R&D phone calls and not. We just can't do it. So it would make more sense perhaps to say that maybe look at the overall percentage of labor and say if 2 out of every 3 labor dollars is going to R&D, perhaps 2 out of every 3 telephone dollars are also going to R&D. That might be more appropriate for some companies than others, but bottom line is we got to be on the lookout for what we would call a practical shortcut versus getting things exact. Let's just take it from the top here. When we ask ourselves whether something is 0% R&D or 100% R&D, a question that can help with that is asking ourselves, if the company were to stop doing any kind of new product development or improving old products and really just run a business based on selling things that you already have, and anything new that you sell is just something that you don't develop by yourself. You just go buy it from somebody else at one price and resell it at another. If that was your new business going forward, all R&D stopped, then let's ask ourselves, would this expense still be here, or would that expense go away? If it would go away, there's a good chance this is a cost of performing research. So starting from the top here, we talked about materials a little bit. This item in blue means if we do your credit, we probably can come up with your materials number for you. This section, things that are probably no R&D or not R&D, these are expenses that would probably carry on whether the company was developing new products or not. Officers' life insurance, just general liability and car insurance, charitable donations. These are going to carry on even without R&D, most likely. Then we have this, maybe it's R&D, maybe it's not, who knows, unless we think about what's in there. Let's use computer software, for instance. This came from a company that has CAD software on a lot of people's computers. I'll bet you this $30,000 is licenses to have that software. But it could also be for having Microsoft Office and some different sales packages, and so it might not all be for design. In a perfect world, you might ask yourself, okay, of the $30,000, how much was for our CAD software? And of that amount, do we only have CAD so that we can do R&D, or would we still need CAD without R&D? And what percentage of CAD do we want to use? It's all pretty subjective, but at the end of the day, our goal should be to make a good faith estimate without going overboard, and hopefully spend no more than a few minutes on each item. Consulting fees, what are we consulting for? Is it to move the company to this state or that state? Probably not R&D. Is it how do we help us understand this new technology that's in our field so that we can use it to make new products? Maybe that counts. Legal and professional, kind of the same question as above. Travel expenses and the related meals and entertainment, like who's traveling? Are they traveling in order to keep the R&D moving forward on a job? Like they're visiting with the customer and tinkering with a machine on site? Or is it more of a sales effort, not R&D? Here we have our labor-driven R&D, which I talked about earlier. And then here's some of the trickier ones, like, well, this one's actually not very tricky. If the word R&D appears somewhere in the name of the account, there's a good chance that it all counts for R&D. But if that's a mistake, if it's not really an R&D expense, then we should change the name of the account. Now let's talk about rent. If in a perfect world, and it might not take long, we could say, okay, of the square footage that we're paying for, what percentage of that like let's say this space here is someone's office space, and all the engineers sit in these desks. People over here do like billing and admin and sales, nothing to do with it. So you might say, what is that? A third of the square footage goes to R&D, but only sometimes. And then we ask ourselves, what percentage of the time is R&D happening in this portion of the footprint? And let's say that's 2/3 of the time. So we might say 1/3 of the square feet, 2/3 of the time, and come up with 2/3 times 1/3. You might say that 22% of the rent is an R&D expense. And similarly, we might want to use that same number as a driver for things like utilities, since there's no real way to look at a list of kilowatt hours and decide which ones went where. And same with the telephone. I used that example earlier. Rent square footage may not be the best shortcut for the telephone, but it can be considered at least. Maintenance and repairs, same deal. And then depreciation. Well, again, in a perfect world, you'd look at which machines or assets are being depreciated, look at each one and say, is the entire machine necessary for R&D or not at all necessary for R&D, or sometimes, and that could get really tedious really fast. So again, it would make sense to come up with some sort of judgment call or practical shortcut there. So there you have it. This 174 exercise, after you're done with all the percentages, gives us an estimate of R&D spending that we can use to say that we've done our due diligence and looked at the 174 Addback. So if you have any questions, then give us a call and we will help you out. Thanks so much.